Yo, what's going on, you guys? Today we have what is Canadian culture. As you guys know, man, I've been reacting to a lot of Canada. I've been enjoying you guys this country. I've been enjoying how beautiful it is. I've been learning a lot about you guys' culture, man. So I'm like, why not learn more about it? What is Canadian culture? So I don't know what to expect in this video, but I'm expecting him to break it down for us, and so by the end of this video, I feel like we'll learn more and more about Canada. So we ain't gonna talk too much. We're gonna get straight to the video, man. Come on.
My name is JJ. So in response to a video I posted the other day, somebody wrote this comment, which I thought was interesting. Why do you always say American when referring to the culture of Canada and the United States? Why don't you say North American? It is a fair question, and they're right. Yeah. I do this, and I do it on purpose because I am trying to make a specific point. So let's talk about that. Whenever you hear someone use the adjective North American to refer to something about the culture of this continent, for example, calling rock and roll North American music, or referring to North American portion sizes, or whatever, it is usually a pretty good tell that the person talking is a Canadian. And what the Canadian is saying when he uses this term is, I want my country to be recognized as a co-equal contributor to the culture of this continent. And frankly, I just don't think this is a very accurate way to conceptualize North America. North America isn't a continent like Europe or Asia or Africa, which house many different nations and nationalities, thereby making ideas like Asian culture or European culture very broad concepts that can be quite challenging to define. You have to look at a bunch of discrete countries with very distinct characteristics of language, religion, history, geography, wealth, and tradition, and try to determine what overlap exists among them. North America, by contrast, is dominated by only two big countries, the United States and Canada, which are very, very similar. I guess I should just pause to say that I am excluding Mexico from this analysis because, in my experience, Mexico is almost always excluded from conversations about North America as a cultural space. I understand that even the Mexicans themselves use the term North Americanos to describe Americans and Canadians as a people distinct from themselves. I'm also not going to get into the whole everyone in Latin and South America are Americans too debate. The question of whether there exists a shared culture uniting the entire Western Hemisphere is a topic for another day. But yeah, anyway, in the conventional understanding, North America just consists of Canada and the United States. These are two distinct political regimes that emerged from the English colonization of this continent in the 18th century. And this common history of British colonization, particularly the degree that the indigenous peoples of North America were viciously but effectively displaced by English settlers and English rulers who created a new society in their own image, was clearly a critical foundation for the powerful cultural similarities that define Canada and the United States today. That said, the cultural history of Canada and the United States is not simply the story of two countries that wound up similar because they started from the same place. This is the myth of North American culture, which, as I said, implies Canada has been an equally active contributor to the contemporary culture of this continent, when I think the more accurate truth is that Canada has mostly just absorbed and emulated the cultural trends of the United States. So the more provocative but more accurate thing to say is that Canadian culture is largely American culture, and that Canadians proud of where they live should be more comfortable self-identifying with this term and this identity. Now, obviously, many Canadians bristle when you say this. There tends to be a lot of resistance in this country to thinking of Canada as being part of America, or the idea that Canadian culture is defined primarily by its Americanness. But to argue that Canadian culture is fundamentally American in nature is not to argue that modern-day Canadians themselves are somehow a culturally weak or submissive people, even though that's often how Canadians think about the situation. When Canadians are feeling particularly dejected, in fact, they will often throw up their hands and say, "What even is Canadian culture?" as if the answer, American culture, is too self-evidently pathetic to even contemplate. But Canada's American character has little to do with the soul of its people or whatever, and everything to do with Canada's particular history as a British colony. So let us talk about that now. So, in the aftermath of the American Revolution, the British politicians back in London were divided by what had caused it. Had England been too harsh on the 13 colonies and provoked them to revolt? Or had they been too lenient and indirectly encouraged them to? It was the second answer that eventually became the consensus opinion, and this had big consequences for how the British would proceed to manage their surviving North American colonies, what became collectively known as Canada. In order to avoid a repeat of the American episode, the British sought to engineer Canada into an aggressively unambitious society that would be much more dependent on Britain, both politically and economically, than the 13 colonies had ever been. As a result, the British proceeded to run Canada during the late 18th and early 19th centuries according to some very specific policy goals. Goal 1. Economically, Canada was to remain pre-industrial. Its economy would be primarily based around hunting, fishing, logging, and farming, with a tariff regime favoring the export of raw materials directly to Britain, and British-made manufactured goods exported back to Canada. Goal 2. Democratic political institutions, like elected governments, were to be suppressed. Things that could lead to democratic attitudes spreading among the populace were also to be suppressed, including a free press, universal public education, or even an effective postal system. Goal 3. Immigration would be tightly restricted and be open only to Englishmen of low social standing and education who could be trusted to be loyal and obedient subjects. And lastly, a regime of propaganda would be used to demonize the United States as an awful place whose problems could all be traced back to its disloyalty to the empire. Trade with the US was to be shunned as much as possible, as were Americans and American ideas more broadly. These policies were effectively implemented, but their success came at a high price to Canada's development as a country. The population remained very low, and a very limited economy prevented the emergence of any sort of Canadian middle class, and with it, the sort of social and cultural infrastructure that a strong middle class helps build. If
I'm not saying nothing, it's because I'm really trying to understand and trying to learn exactly what he's trying to say. Not what he's trying to say, what he's saying. And yeah, that's why I'm just really locked in, paying attention. That's why I'm not saying much in this video.
Summary from this very excellent book on the history of Canadian population growth called Maximum Canada by Doug Saunders. By the 1860s, writes Saunders, Canada had basically achieved what Britain wanted. Over the preceding decades, most ambitious and inventive immigrants to Canada had quickly departed for the United States. The colonies were left with a self-selected group who didn't want much from life, an agrarian, very religious, austere population of peasants and laborers who tended to see change and growth as a threat rather than an opportunity, and a consumer economy as generally sinful excess. In 1867, about 80% of Canada's 3.3 million people were farmers. The majority of them were subsistence farmers, growing only for their own consumption. Even the biggest cities, Montreal and Toronto, were mainly agriculture processing centers. It was not unusual to see herds of cattle driven down Toronto's Yonge Street. The enormous changes that had transformed the Western world in the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of great cities and new technologies, and the use of government to ameliorate social ills had almost entirely bypassed Canada. Now, obviously, this didn't last forever. In the aftermath of the US Civil War, Britain and the United States finally established permanently friendly relations, which made the preservation of a British Canada a less important geostrategic goal for the UK, which led to Canada becoming a more free, democratic, and self-governing place, as well as a place that was less shackled to Britain's restrictive and exploitative imperial trade system. As we have discussed before, the turn of the 20th century saw Canada undergo a burst of industrialization and population growth, instigated in large part by the energetic modernizing administration of Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier. Laurier was a man who quite openly envied the American model of society and dreamed of a Canada that was more like it in terms of its size and wealth and power. That said, the dream of Canada as a nation of loyalist farmers continued for a surprisingly long time. It was only really by the mid-1960s or so that Canada's leaders had more or less definitively abandoned the idea that Canada was going to be run according to a reactionary British imperial fantasy that had arisen in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Even today, it can be quite striking to observe the sheer amount of Canadian families who are only like a generation or two removed from British immigrants who worked in mines or lumber mills. Now, the reason all of this matters today is because Canada's comparatively late development as an industrialized democratic society means that Canada spent much of the 20th century just playing a big game of catch-up with the United States. Like Kimmy Schmidt emerging from the bunker, the country had to make up for a lot of lost time. During its 19th century, America had made countless innovations in science, technology, commerce, philosophy, art, music, literature, food, fashion, and so on, all of which proved equally useful to a country like Canada that was on the same geographic landmass, had a largely similar ethno-linguistic religious composition, and at least by the dawn of the 20th century, was embracing the same style of economy, the same style of cities, and very similar political institutions. So a fast modernizing Canada adopted the innovations of America, and accordingly became a country equally shaped by the inventions of Edison, Ford, and the Wrights, the entertainment of Harlem and Broadway and Hollywood, the arguments of Anthony and Dewey and Douglas, the foods of Hershey and Kellogg and Campbell and Candler, and so on. And of course, this was a pattern that continued throughout the close of the 20th century and continues to this day. The United States, with its larger population, higher intake of immigrants, greater wealth, more developed industries, and world-class infrastructure of ideas, is the country that innovates, while Canada is the country that emulates. In other words, if you want to understand the culture of Canada, you really have to study the cultural history of the United States, since it is overwhelmingly the adoption of American ideas and developments and trends that have made Canada the place it is today. This is not to say, however, that Canadians have been entirely passive participants in this cycle. Obviously, a great many Canadian-born people have played an important role in helping build American culture over the years. Everyone from economists like John Kenneth Galbraith to actors like Christopher Plummer to more idiosyncratic characters like makeup pioneer Elizabeth Arden or James Naismith, the inventor of basketball. There are always anxieties over Canada's so-called brain drain of talent to the United States. But even when a Canadian leaves, Canadians as a whole usually wind up benefiting. We lost Shatner, but gained Star Trek. And obviously Canada has developed all sorts of domestic regional variations of American cultural traditions as inspired by larger American trends. I mean, I have written a whole book celebrating some of the distinctly Canadian foods and brands and celebrities that have become symbols of post-war middle-class Canadian life, but I think it would be naive to think that a few minor regional deviations within an overwhelmingly American existence makes Canada any more culturally separate from the United States than the distinct cultural traits of like the Deep South or Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I mean, Canada and the US are like, man, you can't get no two similar countries than these two right here, man. And that's why, I mean, I love Canada, man. I mean, it looks, to me, I've never been, but from looking at pictures, from looking at the cultures, from looking at the people, it's just so similar. It's like, there's really no difference. So, yeah, I mean, he makes sense. He makes a lot of sense when he says, you know, if you want to look at Canada's culture, you could literally look at the US and kind of see it also there. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
What has always struck me as strange is how so many Canadians, including Canadian intellectuals and politicians, regard this status quo as some sort of monstrous moral failing on the part of Canada. Shame and anxiety over the degree that Canada is a byproduct of American civilization is the defining pathology of Canada, with often vicious anti-Americanism being the preferred coping mechanism, which I have never quite understood. Vicious anti-Americanism is the defining pathology of Canada.
Like, look at this. This is literally looks like a place here. Is it a place here? No, I don't think so. But yeah, it literally looks like it. Like you go somewhere, you go out on the streets, it looks just like this, you know?
In vicious anti-Americanism being the preferred coping mechanism, which I have never quite understood. I personally think America is a great country, and Canada is very fortunate to be an echo of that culture. As far as countries to be an echo of go, you could do a lot worse than the USA. And most Canadians clearly agree on some level, which is why the Canadian government's various nationalistic projects to wean Canadians off American television or music or whatever have generally flopped due to a lack of public support, which is what makes Canadian anti-Americanism such a strange and self-loathing phenomenon. Many Canadians are perfectly happy to use American as a slur, presenting it not as a word that accurately describes their own culture, but rather an insult to
I didn't know that though. I didn't know there was a big group of people who didn't like, of Canadians who were anti-Americans. I really didn't know that. I haven't seen it. I've been reacting to a lot of Canada, and man, you guys been I haven't seen it. Like I said, you guys been real cool. You guys been, the support been real, man. So I really do appreciate that. And yeah, I haven't seen it. That's crazy though.
Bad foreign things. The Canadian press and Canadian politics is full of complaints about American style this or that and the supposed Americanization of Canada. But given the degree that Americanization has been inseparable from the development of modern Canada, an anti-American Canadian makes about as much sense as a Japanese person complaining about the Japaneseification of their country. But you know, Canada is a post-colonial country, and countries of this sort often struggle to abandon their colonial complexes. Canadian anti-Americanism originally arose as an ideology of British imperial control, only to then mutate into other forms of nationalism in subsequent centuries, as I discussed in a whole other award-winning video. But anyway, my personal conclusion has always been that Canada will only ever achieve its full potential as a country when we escape the denialism of the last 250 years and accept the reality that Canada, while not literally part of the United States of America, is nevertheless a component part of a larger continental American civilization that began in the United States. And the more we Canadians accept this reality, instead of responding to it with denial or insecurity or hostility, the freer our government will be to pursue saner policies than they are now, and the more genuinely appreciative and self-aware I hope we will learn to be towards this great American thing we are all part of. I will see you next week.
Yeah, tell me what you guys think, man. Tell me what you guys think. I mean, Canadians, you guys watching, tell me what you think about this video. I'm really intrigued to hear you guys' thoughts on this. Yeah, and tell me in the comments, man. Again, that was a good video, well thought out video, well edited, all of that. It was good. Yeah. Again, thank you guys for watching with me. Continue to like, comment, and subscribe. A lot of you guys that are watching, it looks like you guys are not subscribed. So please, if you can hit the subscribe button, that would be really good. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.